Welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast. I'm John Buckley.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. In the studio today, we have invited a colleague of ours, Ellen Downs, who's flown over from Melbourne this morning. I would love to say it was just for us, but you're a very busy person.
Probably, yeah. But excited to get some time in the studio.
We're very happy to have you here. I'll give the audience a bit of your background. You are a senior consultant at LGM Group with an extensive experience in management consulting across Asia Pacific. You're highly skilled in coaching, strategic planning, and client relationship management with a proven record of driving growth, leading safety-focused improvement strategies, and building strong collaborative partnerships. We've brought you in today because we actually want to get an insight into what it's like to conduct SIF research. And you've had a bit of a role to play in that space. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a bit about what got you here today in your career? And maybe we can also find out how you know John.
Good question. So when I left uni, I started in the chemical industry. I worked for a company that was back then ICI and is now Orica. It was back then a chemical manufacturing company with a little bit of explosives. Nowadays, it's all explosives with a little bit of chemicals. From there, I really engaged with the safety aspect of what we did within the ICI group. And I spent a few years working in partnership with DuPont. And so I really had an amazing grounding in how safety, if we do it well, it makes for all of business opportunities and improvement and general strong performance. And having had a strong personality trait of people orientation, it really connected for me. And why I do what I do, I get to get up every morning and change the experience for people at work every day, using safety as that vehicle for genuine engagement and genuine motivation.
Beautifully said. Now, I want to know the backstory between you two. I think you've been working together for quite some time now, over many different projects.
Yes, we've known each other a very long time. I mean, I joined Russell Consulting, again, from a chemical industry, safety experience, went into Russell Consulting, and that's where we met, and that's where we got the opportunity to work on multiple projects. And Ellen was probably the key national consultant, client relationship manager. So me being on the West Coast, I was Ellen's key contact over here in working with clients. And then as we started to work in some bigger projects in Singapore and PNG, there was also connections there as well. So we've known each other since about 2010.
2010.
Yes. So 15 years of working across different businesses, different projects, all sorts.
I can definitely recognise the coaching skills, and Ellen and I have worked so closely together that I think we've been able to learn a lot from each other around the conversations we have with clients, and being able to connect that then to how we can actually help coach leaders in regards to their role within organisations. And it's good that we are able to do this quite frequently.
In season 1, we delved into a bit of SIF research. We had Ricky Galloway come in and break down some recent studies. And as I said, they were recent, within the last 5 years or so. Ellen, you were involved in some research in the 2010s, and I'm really fascinated to hear sort of the behind the scenes of how that happened. So can you tell us a bit about what you were involved in?
Absolutely. So the research was completely centred around serious injuries and fatalities. So those injuries that can cause life-altering injuries and change of life experience. And it really started before my time, actually, in 2010, led by Thomas Kraus, who was the owner and leader of BST back in the days. And part of that really came out of the fact that we had numerous very large, predominantly US-based companies coming and talking to my colleagues about, including Tom, what are we doing differently that's allowing us to see a trending downwards of general recordables? So LTIFR back in the day, nowadays it's TRIFR. What are we doing there? And yet we're not getting the same results and outcomes out of serious injuries and fatalities. We might get a year where we have 0, and then we have a year and we have 10. The next year we have 5. We have a couple of years of 0. What is it that's creating this differential between recordable injuries and serious injuries and fatalities. So the research really centred around that, and what companies didn't have access to was enough data and or looking at the data in a way that gave genuine insights and meaning to understanding what's going on. You know, what are those causes and correlates of serious injuries and fatalities that are different to total recordable type injury, lower consequence type injuries? And because we didn't have enough data, there was an opportunity to bring together as a consulting firm those organisations and facilitate that based on our extensive knowledge as a business around behaviours, safety and leading with safety from an organisational perspective. So from 2010, there were a number of key findings that came out of that research. I personally, with John and a number of our colleagues, worked very closely with the mining industry for a very long period of time. And the conversations were almost replicable of, we've done a lot of work on catastrophic events and we feel that we have reasonable control over those. We know what can go wrong. We have a sense of those weak signals. We're doing pretty well with TRIFR, like other industry sectors. It's continuing to trend downwards. However, our serious injuries and fatalities still continue. What are we doing differently? And how could you help facilitate this, Ellen, to enable a global industry like the mining industry to come together and really pool our data, our thinking, and get some really good, valuable insights that we can use and apply and implement as an industry and as an individual company. So really that the study that we formed in 2014 with 8 of the global mining companies, mostly at the top end of town, the very large organisations, and they represented those organisations. So we came together and over around about 18 months, we ran a full research study where we led the research, we facilitated the process, and each of the participants would provide data, would provide insights, would provide reflections, and out of that there were a number of findings that came out of that were highly valid.
So back in 2010 then, BST with Kraus doing that original piece of work, and I think that was a bit of a follow-up from stuff they were doing a bit earlier on as well, generally one-on-one with clients, but it was the first time they'd really pulled together a collective group to look at that data. And then 4 years on, the intrigue around the learnings of that obviously sparked the mining industry to take that approach themselves.
Absolutely. And certainly as a global industry, there was a very strong focus on these issues, safety in particular, obviously fatalities and life-altering injuries. It just wasn't obvious or known of how do we go about learning and growing and continuously improving our level of control over what is predominantly the single or dual fatality events in our business.
So, Ellen, while you were gathering and collecting this data, what challenges were you coming up against?
Many. These are big, complex, complicated companies. One of the biggest issues in the early stages was how does each company pool all of their data in a way that's consistent, that we can actually do something with it. Each organisation had different systems, different platforms. They often gathered data, different types of data in different ways, in particular business units, in different countries, or even on different sites. So some organisations found it far easier. Other organisations, one in particular, found it incredibly difficult to pull that data. In fact, I think it took them in memory around about 4 months to get their data into a state that we could actually do something with it. The second challenge from that, once we gathered all the data, was how do we actually apply a systematic overlay to draw out and mine that data to really understand it at a whole of industry perspective. One of the key findings from the first study back in 2010 was the narrative and the depth and quality of narrative in serious incident investigations and reports was really critical. It was in fact more insightful and important than quantitative data. just the data set, a numeric type data set. However, most companies had a high level of variability on the depth of narrative, the quality of narrative, even just being able to understand it. And back in the day, in 2015, which wasn't that long ago, we actually didn't have very good IT platforms that were able to actually do that text analytics. So BST purchased four of those new platforms to be able to test how well they were able to analyse the text data. None of them were successful. So what we ended up doing, which was a very manual and very overwhelming effort from our analytics team, was to actually use a consistent decision tree. So we had a decision tree that we used to apply to be able to filter what we deemed as having SIF potential from the non-SIF potential data. So that was the first cut. So we had an 8-factor decision tree that we overlaid every incident, every data point that we had, and filtered that down to just be those SIF potential incidents or actual incidents.
But the decision tree one, did you find doing that with a collective group of people, some of those incidents transferred over to SIF potential really quickly? Others were pretty heated debates?
There was some of that. However, we actually did it in an isolation.
Okay.
So that first set of analytics filtering was done by an individual analyst.
Okay. Yeah.
With insights. So a couple of us, as the content specialists, I guess, if you like, subject specialists, would come in and overlay our views on some of that so that we had a reliability scale of how to apply the decision tree by the analyst.
Because there's always bias in any
Totally.
process, but it sounds like that process, one of the challenges to address was the organisational bias around what was normal.
Yes.
And, having someone removed, an analyst, actually just using a decision tree help remove a lot of that bias.
Absolutely. Because one of the key outcomes was we found with serious injury and fatality potential events that we still looked at it through a similar lens to TRIFA. We look at the outcome. But in reality, we need to be looking at the inputs rather than the outcome. So a great example is a person. So if we took the outcomes for two different events, one is a non-SIF versus a SIF incident. So let's take driving a car. Someone drives a car and they hit a pedestrian. The result is that the pedestrian breaks their leg at their femur and they have a life-altering injury. When we actually look at the causes and correlates of that, we find that one was a person in a car park. Think about your supermarket car park. The driver of the vehicle backed out and hit that person, and actually it was the trolley that broke the femur of the individual, the patient. If we were to compare that as an absolute extreme example to say I'm driving at 60 kilometres an hour across a pedestrian crossing with a child, next to a school zone, and I break that child's leg at the femur, that is a far more high potential SIF incident. But if we compared the two based on outcomes, we may look at them as common challenges and put them in the same bucket. Whereas in reality, it's about what the inputs are and then how do we deem whether the reasonable man test, does it validly sit in the SIF potential or does it not?
And that's why it goes to the point, it's the quality of the description of the event, regardless whether it's SIF or not, helps, regardless then of focusing on the outcome, actually determining whether it had SIF potential or not. Because I think that's still the biggest challenge organisations are facing. When they're getting a poor quality descriptor, it makes that determination so much more difficult, even if you do have a good decision tree to work from. I want to go back to the first challenge around data gathering. It's interesting you say that, because we still do a lot of work with clients to get data dumps of a couple of years or anything else.
It's still a struggle.
It's still a struggle. I mean, it doesn't seem to have really gotten any better from my experience. I don't know from yours.
I would absolutely agree. I think clients have enormous data sets. The challenge, one of the challenges is the systems side of the data challenge. Our systems don't talk to one another in a lot of cases. We haven't established the platforms to be able to talk to one another. I think nowadays we have AI that assists with that. And we've seen some amazing work in that space. Even very recently, I saw some amazing technology that allows us to sit over the top of multiple platforms as an AI agent. That wasn't available back then. However, I still think there is that challenge of how have we set up our systems to enable people to report data in an effective, consistent, thorough, complete, high-quality way. But also, how are we then using that data for identifying where the causes, the failures, the errors, the potential exists?
And it just seems to me like all the organised, because there's lots of different systems out there and we encounter a lot of them, it does just seem like they're creating systems to allow input, simple output, storage. You know? And when you start to think about, as you say, these organisations have large databases, and you would think systems thinking and building those sorts of systems, you would make it fairly easy for them to download a large amount of that data to then be mined in a way that's effective. But it just seems like all these systems aren't really enabling organisations to do large year-on-year dump of information simply, so they can actually look at correlations over years rather than just individual events and simple trending. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then add to that the time allowed for and the reinforcement and encouragement of the value of narrative. Narrative takes time. Again, technology has shifted that we can use verbal type analytics now to be able to record data and narrative. We've got all sorts of opportunities to do that. However, most companies either don't use it or are not reinforcing and encouraging and checking in.
I'm seeing lots of frequent conversations around that AI now, around how it can help get better data input, but also how it can start to look at data a lot more effectively. But I still think organisations are uncertain about a lot of that and what that's really going to take. And I'm probably speaking on behalf of a few. I think they're even nervous about that not working because they know the data quality is not great, and therefore then its effectiveness is going to be limited. But I still think there's a lot of work to do for organisations to have better data. I just think it's critical that they start improving that process.
And if I reflect back on those SIF research studies, it is absolutely critical that we take the time to do that work. That work is absolutely critical to eliminate fatalities. If we don't do that work, and it's a bit like eating an elephant, right? We're not going to eat the whole elephant in one go, but taking those staged approach, knowing what the future state could look like, is really critical, and we need to start today. We should have started 10 years ago when those findings first came out.
It's not too late. Yeah. Ellen, would you say there was maybe an over-reliance as well on post-incident data?
Yes, definitely. Post-incident data is an incredible opportunity to deeply understand what has gone wrong here and where do those opportunities live going forward? Where are those exposures to those situations happening? One of the key areas one of the key findings was that look for precursors. So precursors are essentially where we have a high-risk situation with controls that are either not around, so they're absent, they're not complied with for whatever reason, and or they're ineffective. But it's also that allowed to continue. They're allowed to continue. Now, in all the data that we looked at and all the incident reviews that we did as part of that study, every single one of those had existing precursors that it didn't take much to scratch the surface and find. However, relying on hindsight and that post-incident opportunity to learn, we've killed or seriously injured someone or potentially come close. So do we really want to operate businesses that allow that to continue? And no, we don't. So that real focus and pivot towards deeply understanding, anticipating, inquiring, being consistently curious, particularly as a leader, whether I'm a general manager, I'm a director, I'm a supervisor, is absolutely crucial to addressing this blind spot, if you like, of precursors.
We're getting better at understanding that precursor in regards to the risk situation, the control, and then the elements of that not being effective, less effective, or allowed to continue. And they're all observable every day. So I think this is why we talk so much about, if you want to create a fatality free future, it's about knowing those circumstances and just actively being involved with them every day. Because just relying on incident data to then classify whether it could have been, to me, I know some people still class that as a leading look on things. We've had a near miss.
It's a lagging.
Yeah, we've had a near miss, and I see it all the time still recorded as a leading, and I'm like, no, it's still lagging. Like, there's still been an event happen. It was just lucky, or due to some other circumstance, no one was seriously hurt or killed. But the circumstances to that, the precursor to that, is still observable. Like, it's still able to go out and see it and experience it, listen to people who are working within it. And I still think that's still underestimated by a lot of leaders and a lot of organisations, to not put so much more emphasis on that. And they put so much more emphasis on the incident side of things when they could be putting a lot more emphasis on the other side of that coin.
Absolutely. It was really interesting in the mining research group, because one of the experiences of the group was that in stage one, we really looked at the findings as a collective of what did we uncover. What we really focused very strongly on in stage one was, what are those high risk situations? What are the attributes or the factors that come together that allow that exposure to exist? So what are the hazardous energies? Who and when and where and why are people engaging with the hazardous energy? And then what's the level of control that we have over the exposure to that hazardous energy? We then walked into, well, what management controls do we have there at the moment? What exists right now? And where does it sit? So one of the findings was that it was the old 80-20 rule. With 80% of our SIF potential exposures where we're managing them with below the line behavioural
administrative
reliant controls. Only 20% of our SIF potential exposures in 2015 in mining actually sat above the line. So we're talking about an extreme example, and the reverse was true for non-SIF. So give you a really extreme example. At a mine site, there's a coffee machine in the kitchen. People keep seemingly to burn their arms and fingers while they're operating a complicated coffee machine in the crib room. So it gets removed. Elimination. Out in the mine site, we've still got light vehicles and heavy vehicles using the same roadway. So we're relying on the behaviours of our vehicle operators to keep each other safe, to control those exposures to people being killed or seriously injured. And we know that happens on a regular basis on a mine site.
And it's very common conversations in the observational process around what are your risks, what are your controls. They rattle off a bunch, and when you listen to them, they're generally administrative in nature. They rely heavily on the individual to get it right every single time. And as humans, we make mistakes. So, there's a very big challenge in front of organisations to be able to push outside of that below the line controls and get above the line. Because, if we're not engineering, substituting or eliminating, and elimination is a lot more possible than people think. Like, when you really think through the work and eliminate the energy or exposure to the energy, then that's a critical place to start.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah. And then there's that real confusion, and that just continuously exists at all levels of organisations. The confusion between a control and what I'll term a safeguard. So a lot of us, I know at Barclays and at LJM, we refer a lot to the difference between a safeguard, which is a process or a method or a document that helps us to keep safe, to enable us to control the exposure to certain hazardous energies. The control is actually an act or a thing. It's a barrier to the exposure, or it's a behaviour, an act.
Yeah, and I mean the common example people talk about is, well, I've got a JSA or a SWIMS or something, and that's a safeguard, that's a process you use, it's the controls that are implemented by sitting down and doing that process. That's important. And we talk quite recently with a few clients as well, just how much we're mixing up energy sources, hazards, risks, controls. We're not even talking about those things accurately, correctly,
or consistently.
And we talk about distinction is important. If we want people to think correctly and have a good understanding of what they're supposed to do, we need the right distinction so people understand what these things are. And I think over the last couple of decades, all those things have moulded into one common conversation, and we're not really challenging it or doing any critical thinking around it either.
But it was really interesting because the study, when we dove into stage 2 of that study, we really looked into management controls in more depth. So not just there is a management control and it's in place or not, the binary approach to controls, but rather when is it hard or impossible or unworkable to be able to do the task and use the control effectively. Because, in the old science of BST, we had really strong data that talked to the 60, 30, 10.
60, 30, 10 was pretty reliable.
Impossible.
Yeah, and I think that's been around a while, and no one else seems to reference that type of connection to the controls, which is a bit bemusing to me, because I think, we just think because we've defined or said these are controls, we just expect it to be easy or enabled for people to do. But when you actually start unpacking scenarios, you start to find there are times where it's difficult. And I really enjoy those debates with leaders when they say, well, they're still expected to go do it even though it's difficult. And I'm like, well, okay, but you're balancing a lot of different things and you're expecting them to get that balance right when a critical control you've got in place is difficult to follow, difficult to implement. And then you've got very small, 10% on average, situations where it's actually not possible, non-enabled or impossible, whatever language you want to use, where you actually can't follow that control at all and they don't use it. That seems to be coming back into the language again. I've seen it around a few times now in some recent studies and some recent methodologies. Barclays and LGM, we use that language a lot when we're asking leaders to be curious about conversations with people. It's not just about testing knowledge and enforcing controls. It's about being curious around how does these people experience doing the work. And from that, you should start to work out the stuff that's easy or enabled, the stuff that's difficult, and the stuff that's almost impossible to do. Because anything that's difficult and impossible, that's the leaders and organisation's job to change that and make it enabled for people. If it's enabled, then you've got to sort of get into some understanding motivations, the personal aspect of that. But it helps leaders, I find, when leaders understand that, it helps them understand what their role is when they go out and find these gaps. And
what the value is of being able to find the gaps and get to the heart of the reality of work. The more we are out there seeing and experiencing and taking the time to be curious, without it, we never learn. We have our vision of how work is done, and then there's the reality of work today. But then I think the final attribute of the precursor analysis and the real insights for that research group was the area of allowed to continue. What's allowing the normalisation of management controls that are either not in place or difficult to have in place all the time or impossible or simply ineffective. It was really interesting because with that group we ended up reverting back to some previous research of another Scott Strickoff, who unfortunately is no longer with us, who did some fantastic research into catastrophic events back in, I think, 2008. And he looked at around about 25 catastrophic events to understand what was going on, what were the primary or the greatest cultural factors that influenced those incidents to occur. And he came up with 4 from that research. Anticipate. So it got back to the old chemical industry days of chronic unease. And what am I curious about? What am I needing to scratch the surface of? I'll never forget a story that Max Lloyd Jones shared with me, who is our company founder, of when he ran many DuPont businesses around the world. And one of them, he spent quite some time within their nuclear business. And one of the things that they used to do every time you walked into a meeting room was feel the wall. People would walk into the meeting room and they'd be touching the wall, and it was very odd. He said he remembers going in the very first time, and he said to one of the fellows, why are you all touching the wall? And they said, because when the wall hums, we're comfortable. Everything is working as it should. When it's not humming or it's blipping out, then we've got a problem and we shouldn't be sitting in this meeting room. So that's really about what is that weak signal and what am I asking? What am I checking out? So then it's about how do I actually inquire about that? So that's we talk a huge amount about curiosity. I know we do, but it's really become a consistent theme for leaders to be curious. That's what we're talking about. It's not a simple, I want to find out how your son's football team went today or this week or last weekend. It's getting really specific. I've got a limited amount of time as a leader with my work crews. I want to really understand what's going on and what could go wrong and how would that play out. So really deeply understanding that and then taking those learnings in a loop back into our system. How do we update, address, remove, stop, start, improve to get better at this? And then how am I checking that it's working? You know, a lot of this is just not rocket science, and it's not all new. You know, plan, do, check, act is a simple task for checking whether something I implemented has actually addressed the problem we've found or the gap we've found.
And Ellen, for the participants of this research, what do you think was the most valuable part of the experience?
Great question. I think it really was that ability to come together with a consistent peer industry group to talk about a critical issue that had not been resolved and that every individual company was grappling with in very similar ways, but trying to take different strategies without necessarily succeeding, which was the elimination of fatalities. I think being able to collaborate in a safe space with a guided facilitation so that as they considered and soaked in the findings from their particular analysis, they were able to really challenge one another, align around those common themes, and think about how we were going to move forward. Whilst as facilitators, we had a methodology to follow, it was highly adaptive to ensure that the value for the participants was there as a group, not necessarily individual outliers, but rather as a group.
Now, I'm very intrigued to hear about what the findings are, but we're going to leave that there for today and jump into the findings in next week's episode. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Thank you. It's fun to go back 10 years.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.